I would like to introduce today's moderator. So, Mona Behl is the Associate Director of Georgia Sea Grant. In this role, she provides administrative and financial leadership to Marine Extension and Georgia Sea Grant by directing the unit's research and fellowship portfolios, building partnerships, and ensuring the quality, relevance, and impact of the unit's activities in Georgia. Mona is also currently on the council at AMS. So Mona, thank you very much for joining us this evening, and I will turn it over to you.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Gideon. Thanks for the coordination and support that you provided to make this webinar happen and for everything that you do behind the scenes. I sincerely appreciate it. Hello, everyone. My name is Mona. It is my great fortune and honor to moderate this panel discussion. I believe that I was chosen to moderate this panel discussion because I recently had the privilege and honor to interview my mentor and former AMS Associate Director, Dr. Bill Hook. And so I did a series of 30 interviews with Bill that are permanently archived in NOAA Voices, which is their oral history archive. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out, I'll drop a link in the chat window and strongly encourage you to do so. But let me bring us back to our current panelists. So I'll begin with a brief round of introductions, and then we'll jump right into the question and answer session. So with us is Dr. Jonathan Martin, who is a professor in the UW-Madison Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, where he's worked for the past 30 years. His research expertise is in mid-latitude weather systems. He's also the author of the book Reginald Sutcliffe and the Invention of Modern Weather Systems Science. Professor Martin has received numerous accolades for excellence in teaching, including the Edward N. Lorenz Teaching Excellence Award from AMS, and he was ranked by the Princeton Review as one of the best 300 professors in the nation. Welcome, Dr. Martin. We also have with us Sean Potter. He is a meteorologist, science writer, and weather historian whose career in weather and communications has included work for the ABC News, Good Morning America, the National Weather Service, and NASA. Sean holds AMS certifications in both consulting and broadcast meteorology and has served as a member of the AMS History Committee, the Committee on the Station Scientists, and the Commission on the Weather and Climate Enterprise Steering Committee. He is a contributing author, editor of WeatherWise magazine, and his debut book, Too Near for Dreams, has been named as academic bestseller by Library Journal. Welcome, Sean. And last but not the least, we have Dr. James Roger Fleming, or Jim Fleming. He is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Science, Technology, and Society, Emeritus at Colby College. Jim is the STS Professor at Colby College. He writes on the history of weather, climate, and human affairs. His most recent book is First Woman, Joanne Simpson and the Tropical Atmosphere. So I'm thrilled to have you all participate in this panel discussion. Thank you all for giving us your time. I'd like to begin this panel discussion, everyone, by asking you to briefly describe us, your project. What is it all about? Maybe we'll begin with Sean, and then we'll go to Jonathan, and then we'll come back to Jim.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Mona, and thanks, Jonathan and Jim, for being here as well. So my book, Too Near for Dreams, chronicles the life and career of Cleveland Abbe, who in 1869 became the first person in America to successfully provide regular practical weather forecasts for the public, based on reports from a network of observers. In less than 2 years after he did this, he would lead the forecasting efforts at the nation's newly established Weather Service, at the time under the U.S. Army Signal Service, now the National Weather Service, and set the standard for scientific research in a career that would last nearly half a century. My book is a first of its kind biography that explores both Abbe's personal life and his scientific career. Decades of diaries and correspondence from the Cleveland Abbe papers at the Library of Congress, as well as first-person accounts, serve as the foundation for telling the story of an individual who has been considered a mild-mannered family man and whose thirst for knowledge drove him to become a giant in an emerging scientific field.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sean. Jonathan?
Thank you, Mona, and thank you again, Sean and Jim, for being along. This is going to be a really interesting night. My book about Reggie Sutcliffe makes the case that three important advances guided the development of the modern dynamic meteorology that led directly to the astounding progress we've experienced in weather forecasting, and that Sutcliffe was the pioneer in all three of those foundational developments. It integrates that scientific contribution with his own life. He was born of meager means. He was the first in his family's history to go to college. The fact that he even received an education is testimony to the concerted but ad hoc social reforms that unfolded over the course of the 19th century in response to the abuses of the early industrial age. The resulting investments in education unwittingly prepared Britain to make its successful contribution to saving the West in the fight against fascism. And Sutcliffe served in important scientific roles throughout the Second World War, as well as in its aftermath, eventually becoming the first director of research of the Meteorological Office in Great Britain. And my feeling was his reputation was way below the profile that his contributions suggested. And that, we live in an age where you can take a quick glance at a mobile phone to get a reasonably accurate weather forecast for the next several days in advance. Responsible governments are seeking scientific answers regarding the likely ramifications of global warming, and an enormous fraction of the global economy depends on the current and future weather. So it seems particularly appropriate that Sutcliffe's story be told. And it's my hope that shining a light on his life and his work will in some way inspire a renewed appreciation for the human dimension in progress and the rich legacy bequeathed to societies wise enough to fully embrace investments in education and basic research.
Fabulous. I cannot wait to learn more from you, Jonathan. Let's go to Jim.
Well, cool. My book is First Woman, Joanne Simpson and the Tropical Atmosphere. I don't know if it's showing up backwards or not on the camera, but Joanne Simpson transformed the science of the tropical atmosphere and set a course for science for professional women to follow, but also for all of her mentees. She had a lifelong passion for clouds and severe storms, flew into them and above them, measured and modeled them, theorized about the role of tropical clouds in the planetary circulation, and mentored a generation of tropical meteorologists. She was the first woman to receive an NSF grant to support atmospheric science. She was a PI at Woods Hole, and she had named professorships at UCLA and Virginia. But she really hit her pace with her NOAA experimental meteorology, where she tried to modify cumulus clouds and experimented with hurricanes. And then at NASA had the Tropical Rainfall Measuring Mission satellite, which was really a great accomplishment for her. She sought equal opportunities for women in science and critiqued those who would oppress her. So she was an admirable person. She put all of her papers into the Radcliffe Institute Library, Schlesinger Library at Harvard, and didn't write her autobiography, but prepared a lot of materials, all archival, that were easily available. And then we could work together I worked with 6 students to work together to make the book.
Jim, I cannot wait to read your book, and Sean and Jonathan, yours too. Joanne Simpson in particular inspired a generation of women behind her, so particularly interested in that. So I encourage all attendees to listen intently and be prepared to ask questions. I should not be the only one who is talking here, but I'll kick us off with one question, which is, what inspired you all to do these projects? And maybe we'll go to Jonathan this time first, and then we'll queue up the other speakers.
Yeah, that's an interesting question for me. When I was notified that I received the offer for a job at the University of Wisconsin in the spring of 1994, I knew what class I had to teach that fall. And it was the class on synoptic dynamics and a frontal cyclone for senior undergrads and first-year graduate students. So I set about putting my notes together for that class right away. I was spending an hour or so a day at the library while I was supposed to be working on my research. And it became apparent almost immediately that Sutcliffe had his fingerprints over the entire foundational level of synoptic dynamic meteorology. And I thought I'd heard of him before, but I didn't really know him as one of the greats like a Rossby or, as Arndt Eliasson. And so I thought, why is his reputation so far below the merit of his contributions? And so that was it put the thought in my mind 30 years ago. And then I got a chance during my sabbatical to come up with an idea for a project. And I thought, I don't want to just go somewhere else and write papers and proposals. I do that here in Wisconsin. I would rather do something different. So I thought, why shouldn't I? It was an audacious thought. Why shouldn't I try to reconstruct his scientific and hopefully his personal life? And that's what set me on my journey.
Wonderful. Sean, would you like to go next?
Sure. I would say that my interest in Cleveland Abbey began more than 20 years ago when I first started getting into the history of meteorology in terms of writing it as freelance writing projects. As you mentioned, I'm now a contributing editor of Weatherwise magazine, but I wrote my first piece for them about 21 years ago. It was a feature article on how weather factored into the work leading up to and during the Wright brothers' first flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina in December 1903. It was for the centennial of that event, so 2003. And as a part of my research, I came across a short piece that was published in the journal Monthly Weather Review, which I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners are familiar with. And it was published shortly after their successful flight. It was actually in the December 1903 issue, but because of delays in publishing, it had that date, even though it took a while after the actual event happened for them to get information to the journal's editor, who at the time was Cleveland Abbey. He served at various points toward the end of his career as the editor of Monthly Weather Review, and he inaugurated a section that went by different titles at different points throughout the journal's publication. But at the time, it was called Notes and Extracts. Sometimes it was called Notes from the Editor, and usually uncredited. Sometimes his initials would appear at the end, but it was only later that I realized that Abbe had written this little blurb, if you will, about the Wright brothers, included some correspondence from them. And in fact, he had written hundreds of these short summaries, if you will, of relevant news items for the journal that appeared under the section or department heading of notes and extracts or notes from the editor. And they were often discussing subject, you might say unusual subject matter, such as the noise made by a meteor, or meteorology of the planet Mars, or science in poetry. And so the more I learned about Abbe and the more I read some of the things that he wrote and things about him, the more interested I became about his life and career. And surprisingly, for somebody who did have quite a reputation, not much had been written about him beyond short biographical sketches that you might find in an encyclopedia or other books. Now, one of Abbe's three sons, Truman, wrote in 1955 in collaboration with a gentleman named J. Cecil Alter of the Weather Bureau, who did not, I think he got credit in the acknowledgments, but was not listed as a co-author, but published a book in 1955 called Professor Abbe and the Isobars. It's very hard to find. It was essentially, wasn't really self-published, but it was published by a small publisher. For decades, this was really the closest thing that we had to a full book-length biography of Abbe. So while very rich in personal anecdotes and other resources, it's far from objective in the way that a biography should be, at least in my opinion. I did rely on it as a sort of a guide in writing my book. But as I said in the proposal for my book, which was published by AMS in 2020, I said that I wanted the book to strive to serve as a single, authoritative, and objective reference on the life and career of Cleveland Abbe. And hopefully that's what happens. Jim held his up. I'll hold mine up as well. There we go.
Fabulous. Great. Thank you so much for explaining that, Sean. Jim, we'll come to you then.
Oh, thank you, Mona. Most works in the history of science are not about meteorology. They're about Copernicus, Newton, Darwin, Einstein. And I was asked that when I first went to the history of science department at Princeton. They said, well, who are you going to work on? I said, none of those guys. I'm working on the history of atmospheric issues. And without exception, most histories of meteorology focus on polar and temperate regions, and possibly rightly so. There's a lot of activity there. And they also focus on the accomplishments of a cadre of male scientists. Joanne did not fit that category. She studied with Rossby at Chicago, and with her reel, that's where she really got her passion for the tropics. But these histories could marginalize or erase completely the contributions of female researchers. I have a metaphor of the popcorn cumulus clouds of the tropics, metaphorically being like the women's careers of circa World War II. And they made maps, and they launched balloons, and they shuttled airplanes, but none of them reached a very towering level. There's a few exceptions I've discovered. Joanne was a hot tower. She was a towering cumulonimbus, but she didn't just do it for her own sake. She did it to cultivate the atmosphere for the next set of clouds, as cumulonimbus tend to do. And so her contributions were important, I think, for the broader history of meteorology, and working together with people like Peggy Limon to start the Women and Minority Commission or efforts to look at the equity issues at AMS. And although another motivation was that although the technical literature on tropical meteorology is immense, and I thought, am I going to read 700 journals and 7,000 papers? No, I'll just follow Joanne's career, and I'll tell the story using a complex narrative, because every person is a complex subject, and using her biography to bring out her work and to look together at what they knew in the 1950s, what they knew in the 1960s, et cetera, up to her tropical rainfall measuring mission with NASA. So there were multiple motivations. I'd like to use the biographical genre to bring in the complexity and to stay away from kind of a linear approach. Earlier today, I spoke at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute here at Penn State, and it turns out that her biography is actually a horrible challenge, that she had to face sexism and her own personal demons, her concern about her anyway. She had to face a lot of personal challenges. She didn't want to reveal those things in her career because she thought it might block the future of other women. So after retirement, she put all of this information into the Radcliffe archive. She was identified by Radcliffe as an exceptional woman, and put all that in there, annotated photographs and things. And so she really did personify kind of the hot tower cumulus that she wrote about. And I found it to be an interesting way to pursue this, and to bring, as I said before, 6 of my undergraduate students into the archive. We could get there in 3 hours. If we left at 6 a.m., we'd be there by 9, and get into the archives and put in the white gloves and look at the photographs and try to figure out what's going on with her life. And so that was my inspiration behind it. I had done other biographies, or I had done Guy Callender and the anthropogenic greenhouse effect, and I had also found some other interesting aspects of Bjerknes and Rossby and Wexler and even Ed Lorenz. But this was a big biography. And what I had to do, I had to be careful, because I admired Joanne so much that I had to be careful to maintain an objectivity behind the writing. So we went to Chicago, we checked her archives there at the university. We interviewed a lot of people that worked with her, and we tried to surround the Radcliffe archive with other sources of information.
I'm We're gonna stay with you, Jim, and I'm intrigued by the fact that your students, and something that Sean and Jonathan have mentioned too, just the amount of research that goes into undertaking a project like this. So, could you briefly reflect a little bit on the research process that was used to do this work, and the amount of time that it took for you from the start to the completion of this project?
Oh my, every book takes at least 7 years. It takes some time to identify the ideas. I tend to play with my ideas before I work on my projects. And so I've given many, many seminars on Simpson and, Joanne, and get feedback from people. The bottom line for me is to find an archival foundation, not necessarily in the library, but in the archives, or find new materials on people. This happened when I was looking at Bjerknes. I discovered one of his students named Anne-Louise Beck, and Beck had done the Norwegian analysis of U.S. weather maps and brought them to the Weather Bureau in about 1922, and was rejected. I mean, the Monthly Weather Review editor didn't like her stuff, so she could have been, might have been, should have been a kind of a pioneer in Bergen methods into the US, but it took another 10 or 15 years after that. But Anne-Louise Beck was one of these people, and her archival record is very thin. Rossby's is very thin because he traveled a lot. He was a moving seminar. Harry Wexler has a lot of material in the Library of Congress. He was head of research at the Weather Bureau. And Ed Loren's papers are now at the Library of Congress, which provides a nice foundation. So I looked for material, for rich archival materials, and then work my way. I said, like, one of my sayings is like the pathway to enlightenment leads through total confusion. But one of the branches of that path also leads to further confusion. So I don't know. I wanted to get my undergraduates involved. I taught at a small college for 3.3 decades, and I did use the multiple seminar approach to give talks everywhere I could get invited, to give an account of Joanne and get some feedback.
Terrific. Sean, what does it take to create something that is the single authoritative book on someone?
Well, pretty much what Jim said, and I just want to point out that yes, I'm familiar with Anne-Louise Beck when I co-authored with David Schultz, who at the time was, a few years ago, the managing, or the editor-in-chief of Monthly Weather Review. As you know, Jim, we co-authored a very lengthy and detailed history of that, and mentioned some of her. And I would say that was long after Cleveland Abbe's death, so he was not the editor at the time. It was I believe it was A.J. Henry, who rejected her papers very unfortunately. But as far as what it took to put my book together from start to finish, I probably should have, spaced it out more, had more time, but I was on a bit of a maybe self-imposed strict deadline, in that I first submitted the proposal to publish the book to AMS in the spring of 2017, and I think by the fall I had a commitment from them that they were interested in publishing it. We had had some negotiations and going over the finer points of the contract over the next few months, and then actually was at the annual meeting in Austin, I believe, in early 2018, where I signed the contract and had already started working on it. I think I'd already started writing the first chapter, and had done quite a bit of research beforehand. As I mentioned, first really became interested in Abbe 20 years ago. So it was at least, about 14, 15 years ago at the time. And so I was collecting a lot of information, had a lot to do once this project actually became, I guess, greenlit, if you will. And but my goal was really to try to get it published in time for the AMS Centennial meeting in Boston in January 2020. So that gave me just about let's say 2 years really from proposal submission to actually submitting the manuscript, because of course there's a lot of time that has to go into editing it. It was already edited a lot, several times on my end. My wife was professional editing and journalism background, edited it as well, but we had professional copywriter go through it, and a lot of back and forth and getting it proofed and ready so that we could meet that publication deadline, which we did just barely. I think we were, as I recall, the somebody from EMS had to go and personally bring boxes from the printer, so they would be there at the time the exhibit hall opened on that first Monday of the centennial meeting in 2020. But what this meant in terms of writing it and researching it is that I sort of had to do the research and writing phases of the project in tandem. So one thing I would do, I spent a lot of time as I mentioned, at the Library of Congress, and living at the time in Washington, D.C. Really was a boon in that respect, and as was the fact that the library manuscript reading room, it was the manuscript division, is a manuscript division that houses the Cleveland Abbey papers. And there are other institutions that have Cleveland Abbey archives and papers, but the Library of Congress is really considered the sort of the main repository of his papers and manuscripts and correspondence. So that's what I relied on primarily as the basis for the book. And the fact that the Library of Congress, this is in the Madison building, the manuscript reading room is open on Saturdays. I was working full time at NASA headquarters, actually not far from the library. In fact, just a quick anecdote. I remember one day, I think it was maybe the day before Thanksgiving, we got a 2-hour early dismissal or something. And so what did I do? Instead of going straight home, I think I even walked up Capitol Hill there, right past the Madison building is kind of, kitty corner from the U.S. Capitol, and went there because they didn't close 2 hours early, and was able to get a little bit of research in there. But I spent a lot of time on the weekend, on Saturdays, going there and doing research. That was, as I said, the main set of source material, and really carefully, systematically poring over what ended up being thousands of pages of mostly handwritten correspondence and other material. I think it's like 32 boxes in total. And I've looked at one point or another inside each of those 32 boxes, and some are strictly correspondence. Some have, other things that are maybe more ephemeral and not as directly related. But one of the things that really helped was the fact that I was able to go there, have pretty open access as a researcher to this collection. And then rather than spending time and actually trying to read and decipher all these letters while I was there, because I knew my time at the library was very limited. And for those of you, I know, Jim, you've done some research there, seen the Abbe papers. He was known for having particularly poor handwriting. I think his family, his siblings even kind of teased him about it. So a lot of these were handwritten, and it wasn't just letters that he wrote, it was letters that his parents wrote, that colleagues, friends, and acquaintances and so forth. But a good deal of it were in his own handwriting. So what I would do is they were in chronological order, of course, in folders. So I would kind of quickly go through the time that I had and try to determine which ones seemed like they might be of interest, and then scan them. And the Library of Congress has these wonderful scanners, I think, in most of their reading rooms, that are available free to the public, free to researchers. Plug in a USB drive, adjust the settings, put the item down, and push a button, and you get this beautiful high-res scan that then later I could take home and kind of go over in more detail and try to determine, what was of interest. And if something did seem like it was of interest, I transcribed it. And that's became the really challenging part, is transcribing these key pieces of correspondence And as I mentioned in the acknowledgments section at the back of the book, often with the help of my wife, Sarah, whom I credited is having discovered a hidden talent for deciphering hard to read 19th century handwriting. So just in terms of this aspect of it, going over the correspondence from the Abbe papers at the Library of Congress, I ended up with an 87-page Word document with the transcribed correspondence. Again, just the key pieces that I thought might be relevant to the book, arranged chronologically. And then, of course, it becomes this sort of behemoth challenge to try to determine, well, what do I do with all of this? And, I can't put all this. It was 50 some thousand words. It was almost, it was like almost half the length of the book itself. So then I had to go through and sort of highlight sections of the text that I'd already transcribed that I thought I might want to include. And I came up with a color-coded system. I showed a slide on this when I gave a talk at the 2020 annual meeting in Boston, where basically I highlighted different sections from these pieces of correspondence using different colors based on different categories that essentially corresponded to some themes or sub-themes of the book. And those were Abbe's life in Russia during the mid-1860s. And he studied at the Nicholas Central Observatory in Pulkovo, just south of St. Petersburg. His work as the director of the Cincinnati Observatory, where he began his forecasting efforts, and then later his career in the Weather Service, his personal life and marriage, the Civil War, because he was, living through it, had wanted to enlist, was unable to because his nearsightedness. Some passages about the weather itself that, of course, because of because of his work and were relevant and interesting to include, and then just miscellaneous topics. So did all that, color-coded, and that really helped me organize and find the best use of this large amounts of textual information, and allowed me to essentially separate the wheat from the chaff, as you will. And if I didn't have that sort of systematic way of doing it, it would have been really difficult. And so I think that kind of made it possible to do it within the time frame that I set out.
That is just fascinating. So, Jonathan, 2 years for Sean, 7 years for Jim. Where are you on that time scale, and what's your research process?
I'm a lot closer to Jim. It was like 6.5 years for me. And the method was sort of an amalgam of a whole bunch of different serendipitous events. I mean, I started out thinking I really do want to kind of encapsulate Sutcliffe's scientific contributions, but I sure hope I can integrate his personal life. But when I set out with that set of goals, I had no connection at all to his personal life. He left no letters, no diaries. I think I discovered as I went through the work that I think he just gave up on that idea, because everything he and his wife had saved, I think, was destroyed in the firebombing of Portsmouth in January 1941. And I think he just decided, I'm done with that. I'm not going to worry about saving things. He was not a particularly sensitive person in terms of history himself. But I did find out, I did make a connection with his daughter, Ellen, his older daughter, and then made a connection with his younger daughter. And so once I got a connection with the family, things just went crazy on the personal side. And it turns out that every time I took a trip to England, I took 7 or 8 different trips to England over the course of all those years. I had one sabbatical year where I took 3 of them. And everybody in Britain was happy that a Yank was coming over here to do this work on somebody who was a British citizen, and they didn't even expect that anybody over here knew about him, especially his family. And so at every turn, I spent I don't know how many hundreds of hours in the at the British Archives, the National Archives in London, and echoing some of what Sean said, it cost money to get their technology to take scans. Thank God for the cell phone. I took pictures of about 1,000 documents, and then I realized how good the resolution is when you blow it up on a screen. You can read everything. Sutcliffe had second grade handwriting teacher's handwriting. It was really clear. His younger daughter, Jenny, had an autobiographical sketch that his older daughter, Ellen, thought didn't exist. And so there was internal conflict in the family. And I got a hold of a whole bunch of documents that I would never have been able to put this book together without. So the process evolved, it snowballed. And I took full advantage of the fact, as I said, that the Brits I ran into were very happy to cooperate at every turn, and especially his family. And so the project ended up taking on a spiritual side that I never anticipated, and changed my life in a lot of ways. It really did. And both of his daughters are still alive. And so we've stayed in correspondence after the book was published. But that was the strategy, was to just acquire as many documents as possible, echoing Sean's comments about I had plenty of time to work on it at home. I didn't have so much time in London to do anything. I realized that almost right away, that it was going to be an acquisition and reflection project. And the acquisition was going to be on the trips. The reflection was going to be over the 6 years. And so I ended up doing it from 4:30 to 7 a.m. Monday through Friday over 6 years, so that it didn't interfere with my regular day job, because I'm not a historian. So I couldn't do that. And that's how it worked for me. But as Jim says, it gives you time to think about what you're doing, what story you're telling, how you want to tell it, and so on. If you do it all quickly, it would have been, for me, it would have been difficult to get to the way that I wanted it. So I'm glad I had to surrender 6 years of my life waiting for this project to end, because it ended up making it better.
Just one comment on both of the Sean deserves and Sarah, they deserve honors for deciphering Cleveland Abbey's handwriting. He was quite a scribbler, and the reflection with Jonathan, I almost wore out. I wore out the elbows of my shirt, because I was using my hands and my computer back as a background for shooting these documents with a digital camera. And so I could read the whole document very quickly, photograph it, imagine where it would be as sort of a paragraph in my voice in the book. But then I would be exhausted. I get back to the hotel, working at the library, it's very expensive, as they said. And I would have to recreate those images, those initial impressions of the documents later, once I was writing. So it was a process of acquiring documents, almost instantly seeing ways that they could fit into the narrative, and then working not from 7 to whatever. What was your time period? 4 to 7.
4:30 to 7, yeah.
4:30 to 7. I would work from 9 to 1 in the night. I was doing 3 a day things. And the last thing I would do was read something new, some new archival collection, and sleep on it, and not try to analyze it, just dream about it.
Great.
So then in the morning, I would have new things to say.
Yeah, I'm more with you, Jim. I'm more of a night owl. So I think for me, it was doing the work, the writing, and it was usually after, when my wife went to sleep, or and I didn't mention this, that so when I submitted the proposal in 2017, it was right before our wedding. So we did that, and then we jetted off to Italy. Actually, is where we got married, and then it was in early 2018 when our son was born. So a good portion of the time I was doing this, I was also dealing with that. And you joke about, yes, Sarah does deserve a lot, not just for the deciphering, but other aspects, and just for patience, of course, and willingness, because at the time she was staying home with our son. So I would come home from work, and sometimes I would have left her with some printouts of Abbe's letters, saying, "Can you just take a look at this and see if you can make sense of, or even just this section?" And I'd come home and find her on the couch with our infant son asleep on top of her, and a stack of printouts of letters from Cleveland Abbey. Or we'd be, I'd have them up on the screen, and blowing up, and say we'd just be like spending, seemed like an hour or so trying to go over one word or even one letter in one word, just to try to figure out what it was. And it was kind of like solving some sort of a word puzzle. But I don't know, John, if Sutcliffe had his, or probably because he came along a little later, I don't know how much of his handwriting you had to deal with, but
he had spectacularly clear handwriting. So,
but that's right. You mentioned that the second. He was
I was so
the opposite
lucky.
of Abbe.
Even in his 80s, he could handwrite with just perfect clarity. So I had none of those troubles. I'm sorry you did.
Well, luckily later on in Abbe's career, they started using typewriters a little more frequently. So that that gave me some relief.
This is amazing. Sean, if Sarah wouldn't have helped you, probably you too would have been closer to Jim and John's timescale, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
Kudos. All right. Well, we're also getting now. I'm gonna merge audience questions in the time that is remaining. So, Steve Ackerman, who probably read my mind, asks you the next question, which is, what was the most difficult part of writing your book? And we're going to save the responses to his second part of the question towards the end. So tell us about some of the challenges that you encountered in this process. And maybe we'll start with John, you first.
Okay. Echoing some of my prior comments in the prior question, Sutcliffe left very little primary source material. It turns out there were a few letters that he sent to his wife during World War II that were pivotally important for parts of the story, and I didn't discover them until well into the process. And she didn't know she had them, his daughter. So we discovered them together. So it was, I pretty much knew going into it after the first visit that I was not going to find a lot of primary materials left by him or his wife. And that was going to be a bit of a problem. But then some of that was remedied by the autobiographical sketch that we did find halfway through the project. But the bigger challenge for me, I think, was just trying to imagine a story that was not like a lecture in my class that actually motivated the whole episode in my life. I didn't want it to be so purely scientific that it didn't have broader interest. And so thinking about the right context within which to place this story was a bit of a challenge, and I think probably the biggest challenge. But I was aided by the tenure of Governor Scott Walker in Wisconsin, where he tried to destroy the University of Wisconsin in a number of different ways, and that got me angry. And there were a whole bunch of different episodes in the Sutcliffe life, both in his grammar school years and then in his own contributions at the University of Reading, where public education and its great importance for society was emphasized, and he was a beneficiary of that. So it contrasted beautifully with the frustration I was feeling in my regular life to be able to amplify those elements of the Sutcliffe story. So that helped me resolve the dilemma that I had, which I think really was, what's the context within which one places these important contributions? And so that you get away from just continuously saying, we wouldn't have a 7-day forecast today if it weren't for Reggie Sutcliffe. You can say that once, people will pay attention, but there has to be more to it than that. And so that helped a lot. And that was one of the biggest challenges.
Thank you. Jim, would you go next, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think my biggest challenge being in the history of science profession was getting it through review and finding the right publisher. That's an important step for a book. And I had worked with one press and made a proposal. It was after I had finished a book with them, and I pitched the Joanne story. And when they sent it out to review, they sent it to people that were truly feminist scholars of science who had never heard of Joanne and weren't interested in meteorology. There was no literature on her. And here's a guy writing something about a lady. And so there was a cultural barrier there between the reviewers. I got a couple, I thought unfair reviews, but that's just my opinion. And then Oxford picked it up, and I was very happy with their production. And so that was a challenge. It was trying to find the right publisher, and it was also trying to find the right tone. I had to read beyond the archive and be better educated on different waves of feminism through the 20th century. Margaret Sanger, second wave feminism, third wave feminism. And we came to a decision. I talked this over with my students that Joanne was certainly steeped in the feminist tradition, but was not a feminist in the dyed in the wool of man that attend the barriers kind of way. But she made waves of her own. She was like a fourth wave. She made waves through the profession of meteorology that allowed others to get on to go ahead and sort of surf on the waves that she had formed. So that was some challenges, just to put it in the right context and to be a guy writing about a lady.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. Sean, what about you?
Yeah, well, I mentioned a couple of challenges that I dealt with already, but there's some other challenges that I faced in writing the book that I didn't necessarily anticipate at the onset, and these were dealing with topics that I really didn't think I would necessarily uh, be considering when I first started the project. Abby was really, I would say, is a complex, faceted person, and as the project progressed, it became clear that I needed to address several sensitive but relevant topics in order to tell a really complete and accurate story of his life. And this included his close relationship with his friend Albert Bickmore, who founded the American Museum of Natural History, issues related to race and eugenics, and even mental health issues, and incorporating these issues into the overall narrative meant that I had to kind of step aside from the main work of researching Abbe and kind of do some little mini research projects on these other issues so that I could give them I guess the coverage that they deserved in the context of what I was writing. So, I was learning about race, and not just race and race relations, today, but the history of that. What did it mean? What were race relations like in the late 19th century, and how could I interpret some of Abbe's writings in that context? There were accusations made by some members of the community that he may have been involved in the eugenics movement, which was really in its infancy, at least in this country, around the time he passed away. And so, really trying to leave no stone unturned, I wanted to look at that, and also, though, try to understand more, what I was looking for. So understand, what that whole movement was about, and who were some of the key players, especially when it did relate to the sciences. And actually, just as a side, that led to an ad hoc committee being formed by the AMS that issued a report. And I think that's one of the links that that I had submitted to include later on if folks are interested, just to read more about that particular episode. And then I mentioned his friend Bickmore, Albert Bickmore. He just called him Bickmore or Bick, who they known each other since let's say kind of college years, but then became really close friends the rest of their lives. And you read some of the diary entries of Abbe's little pocket diaries that were actually some of the absolute gems of the collection of his papers at the Library of Congress. These small pocket diaries that you would buy commercially, kind of like I remember my dad used to go and get free little pocket calendars at the bank, and at the front they would have maybe like calendar and tables of weights and measures. And it was similar back in Abbe's day, that you would get these, and they would have things like distances between cities and timetables for trains and so forth. But he jotted little notes in there, and these were really great insights into his personal life, especially. And he talked about his close, even just in not in so many words, but his close relationship with his friend Bickmore, to the point where then I come across some entries where it said, on this day, da da da, and spent the night with Bickmore, or slept with Bickmore, bathed with Bickmore. And you're kind of took a step back and was thinking, what am I reading here? But then without jumping to any conclusions, realized that that interpersonal relationships, especially between maybe two people of the same gender, may have been different at that time than they are now. And it doesn't. And so I wanted to make sure I got this as right as I could, thinking about some of the things that have been said about, Abraham Lincoln and his friend Joshua Speed and others. And I'm not going to, you can read what I wrote. And it's good teaser to pick up a copy of the book and read what I wrote about it in there. There's, but it was something that I just absolutely did not think, that looking at, human sexuality and the concept of what's essentially called fraternal love was something that that would be relevant to this book. And so I would say that those were some of the things that they were challenges, but ones that I happily or eagerly, let's say, took on.
Thank you. John, would you like to share something?
I already did on this question.
Well, then I am going to pivot to the next question, which is by the AMS president, Anjali Bamsai. Anjali asks, could you shed some light, and this question is for you, John, could you shed insights on why Sutcliffe's contributions have been somewhat underappreciated? Was it that he was low-key by nature and not a self-promoter? Or was it because he came from a relatively modest background? He founded the top-notch Department of Meteorology at the University of Reading.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Anjali. I think that it's a combination of a couple of things, but the highest profile suspect in my mind is that he was a retiring personality. And the anecdote that really encapsulates that in his life is that as he was approaching the age of 60, they had to have Graham Sutton was about to retire as the director of the Met Office. And so there was a search on for a new one. Sutcliffe was at the British retirement age. He wasn't going to be the director of the Met Office. His daughters tell me that he never really complained about that. He didn't have a particular desire to do it. The person they started to settle on was Brian Mason, B.J. Mason. And it's weird for me to think about this because my PhD advisor, Peter Hobbs, was B.J. Mason's graduate student. And so I have this interesting relationship in this story. But Sutcliffe resigned his post at the Met Office rather than work for Mason. And the reason is Mason was a well-known self-promoter. And one of the things that was going on in the background in Mason's mind was, we're going to bring numerical weather prediction to the British public in the first year of my term as director. That was going to be in 1965. Sutcliffe, Sawyer, Bushby, others, Mavis Hines, who had been really headlining people that Sutcliffe hired in the branch, decided or had the opinion, we are not ready for a public display of what we're doing. And Mason was going to go forward with it anyway. They had the first ever Met Office news conference, November 2nd, 1965. So Sutcliffe retired knowing that was coming. I don't think he could take the combination of his retiring personality with Mason's self-promoting personality. I think that's more it than anything else. But it's just a guess. Unfortunately, he had left no comment about that. He said he had got along fine with Mason. He just didn't want to work for him.
All right, with just 6 minutes remaining, I'm just going to ask you one last question, and I'd request that you keep your comments very brief to a minute or less. But what advice would you give to others who want to write books and do similar kind of work? And John, maybe we'll start with you this time.
I would say do it. 100% go for it. It changed my life, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that, and in ways that are difficult to account for. It changed my sleeping habits. I've not recovered, actually. My sleeping has been destroyed by the project, so be prepared for that. But I think Jim made a comment along these lines earlier. You know, every individual person is a huge, treasure chest of interesting stories. And so if you get the motivation to go and do this, I would say follow that motivation. And then you can deal with whatever issues come along as you do it. But I would say without hesitation that it was a great experience, and I aim to do it again. I won't disclose on who because I want to keep that secret, but I do want to do it again.
Fabulous. Sean?
Yeah, and echoing what Jonathan said, I also encourage anybody who has that interest in writing really any kind of book, but especially a biography of meteorologists, because as Jim said earlier, we need more of them. There's a sort of a dearth of literature out there in this genre or subgenre of history of science. So I really encourage anybody considering writing a biography of a meteorologist, or really anyone for that matter, to really carefully consider two things: both the subject and the available records related to that subject, especially primary source material. You've heard all three of us talk about that. And I think it goes without saying that biographers need to have a deep-seated interest in their subjects in order to get through the sometimes tedious process, which we've also all talked about, of researching them and writing about them. But you should also consider whether your subject has broad appeal beyond your own personal interest, and whether the biography would add something new to the existing work, if any, relating to the subject. And this really goes hand in hand, I think, with having access to a fairly comprehensive set of primary source material, be it letters, manuscripts, diaries, what have you, preferably material that maybe hasn't been used or not used extensively in any previous work. So you really can shed some new light and really suss out some of these anecdotes and stories that I think we all have done a good job of doing with our respective subjects to make it very readable. And you really want to let the subject tell their own story to some extent, weaving together the primary source material into a larger story with as much of a narrative arc and, if possible, some dramatic tension. And I think you'll end up with a much more compelling work in the end as a result.
Fabulous. Jim.
Yeah, Joseph Henry once told Cleveland Abbey, he said, "Just finish and publish. I mean, do it." As you said, there is another old saying that writing is very difficult. It's very much you have to come out of yourself and you have to get into the shoes of the other. But there's also another saying that writing is easy. Just open a vein and begin. And there's a metaphor there, but and this is for the scientists that might be online, the people that have not written biographies, but look at your own records, keep them. Look at what Mona has done. Interview people. Bill Hook has given. There's a tape recorded interview projects. There's archives at the American Institute of Physics. Contribute your own ideas into the corpus of what we know, and maybe don't be too much like Sutcliffe or be more like Joanne. I mean, she did keep a lot of things, and Abbe kept a lot of documents too. But think of it that way, and it's very difficult because you have to do. If you're in another field like teaching meteorology, you're going to have to steal the hours away from the other things you need to do. So just do it. Finish and publish, as Joseph Henry would say.
Fabulous. Well, on those words, inspiring words, thank you all so much for sharing your perspectives and the stories of such great meteorologists in our field. I'm going to turn it back to Gideon to close us off.